So now that we have extracted the data that we are going to be using for PCA, we should set up some precondition. So our question will be, can we reduce the number of variables, so present, explain, communicate, teach, workload, and difficulty, into fewer components? And the answer is yes. But naturally, you want to know how to do it. To do so, we need to examine the intercorrelations between the variables, but from before, you might have noticed that the variables present, explain, communicate, and teach say something about the professor's communication skills, and workload and difficulty represent something, say how difficult they're making the course more generally. So greater numbers or workload represents that professors assign more readings and have more quizzes and so on and so forth. And difficulty is just a subjective evaluation from each student about how difficult the course was. So we know that perhaps the two variables will emerge, and one of them is going to be professor's social skills, and another variable is going to be the workload or the difficulty for the course. The variables that specify how good the professors are at communication, as I wrote in here, and the variables that track the course difficulty. Let's examine whether this may be the case, and the first thing that we want to do is take a look at the correlation matrix between the variables. So here, if you're going from the inside parentheses to the outer parentheses, you see that I'm specifying the data that I want to use, the comp data that contains all the variables that we have for PCA, and I'm running the correlation analyses on those data, and I'm telling to output the all of the correlations, but rounded to 3 digits past the decimal point. So looking at the correlation matrix, you can immediately see that presents that there's ones across the diagonal. So those are going to be the standardized variances of each one of the dimensions that we have in the datasets currently. Then we see that the dimension present and explain are correlated at 0.85, so they're probably tapping it pretty much the same thing. So you can see the high correlations between all of the variables that describe the professor's communication skills. Similarly, you see a relatively high correlation between the difficulty and workload of 0.7. However, once you look at the other correlations between the difficulty and workloads with variables such as present, explain, communicate, and teach, what you see is very low correlations. So that means that these variables are probably not tapping into the same construct. So we can take a look at the correlation matrix in this particular case and quite easily tell that we probably will have just about 2 main components that will emerge. However, now once you start imagining the larger matrices, it would be very difficult to examine the correlation matrix or go through the items themselves and to actually identify the variables that might be closely related to each other versus not as closely related to each other. So imagine that set of 20 variables, then 100, maybe 1,000 variables, or 10,000 variables. So those data sets can be quite complicated to identify just by looking at the matrix or by looking at the codebook. So we need to make some decisions about what we're going to be doing. So our decision is that there's probably going to be 2 components, and so we're going to name them, say, communication and workloads. And we are going to assume that components are probably going to be orthogonal. So that is, the 2 components are probably not going to be highly correlated with each other. We can tell this from the correlation matrix in here, as we can see really low correlations right here and really high correlations here. But also, principal component analysis typically does just make an assumption that the components are going to be orthogonal to each other. So now what we want to do is essentially run the PCA and check it empirically. So as you remember, we have loaded the package psych, which contains the all of the functions for the principal components analysis and the factor analysis. Of note here, I want to say is, as you have noticed previously, the means for all of the variables that we're examining are quite high. So just make sure to check your distributions before you actually proceed with the analysis. But in the current case, these data are used only for demonstration purposes. So now what I'm doing in here is I'm running the principal components analysis using the function from the psych package, PRComp, And in parentheses, I'm specifying the data that I want to use to run this analysis. I'm saying to center these data and to scale it. So that is, we're going to be standardizing each variable. So the mean of each variable is going to be 0, and the standard deviation is going to be 1. So this will produce an object, and I'm assigning this the output of this function into object PCA solution. So now to take a look at the PCA solution, you want to write the command print and examine the PCA solution itself, which will produce standard deviations of each one of the components. So the standard deviation here, standard deviation here, and those parameters are not super useful to us. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to square each one of those standard deviations to get the variance of the component, and those are displayed right here. Next, you will see the rotations, and rotations in this particular case are representing the factor loading, so the correlations between each item and each principal component. So factor loadings, component loadings, they typically describe a very similar thing. So what you can see in here is principal components 1, principal component 2, and all of them up to 6. So as I have mentioned in the lecture, the principal components analysis will extract as many components as there are originally dimensions in your data set. So examining the very first component, you see that the present, explain, communicate, teach loads on this component quite well. Workload and difficulty seem to be assigned to different components. In particular, they're assigned to more so to components 2 and perhaps the component 4, which tend to be very similar to each other. So looking at the variances explains they variance